What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York calling from Zoom again, and this time we are here with Brian Fair of Shadows Fall. Thank you so much for being here today, man. It's great to have you here.
Dude, I'm stoked. I'm glad to be here. Very excited to have something to talk about in the Shadows Fall camp. It's been many a year since we have, so kind of like awakening the beast again, and very stoked. So thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I got to tell you, you guys reuniting was definitely one of the greatest pieces of metal news to come out in 2021, and we really look forward. It feels so great to have Shadows Fall back. And one thing I'm curious about is with this reunion, was there kind of like a pinnacle moment to why you wanted to do the reunion this year? Was it, last year being the anniversary of One Blood, next year being the 20-year anniversary of Art of Balance, even next year being the 10-year anniversary of the last Shadows Fall album, Fire from the Sky? What was the sort of moment?
Which is crazy to think about.
Yeah.
That's insane to think about. It's almost a decade that. But it was kind of a combination of that type of stuff. Like we kept realizing, man, there's some major dates kind of happening in our career, anniversary wise. We had all stayed in touch. So the idea of doing a show had always been floated out there. But I think a few of those key dates kind of got the ball a little more really rolling, where we were like, you know what, it's been 5 years now. We should do it. We had a date locked in. Everything was about to start, and then COVID, and it shut it all down. We're like, all right, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a 15th anniversary or 20th anniversary. We can bump it a year now and, try again. So I was just so glad when we finally got to get it locked in for the second time and announce and know it was really happening. And been a few scares along the way if it was going to keep happening, though, just because of the state of the world. But, so I think it was just us realizing it's been long enough as well. It wasn't like, we're like, man, we haven't played in a while. Everyone kind of had the real itch, the actual desire to do it. And, man, we got together and thankfully a good team got it all to make sense. If we were going to do it, we wanted a thick bill. We wanted a bill that made sense and with some of the people we, know well, like, so getting Unearthed, Darkest Hour, Sworn Enemy joining on, and then, other local bands like Within the Ruins and Carnivore. Once we had that locked in, we're like, all right, man, this is big time. Let's do it. Let's do it right. And stoked.
Yeah, for the set list that we're getting, are you going to maybe do like Of One Blood in full or something, or Art of Balance in full? Or?
We're not doing a whole record. That was the problem, is trying to narrow it down. That much of a catalog was hard enough. So we decided to kind of do something from everything. So there is stuff back all the way from Of One Blood, which kind of crosses over the Somber Eyes era because there were some of the same songs, on both records. So, and then all the way up to stuff from Fire from the Sky. So, yeah, it was tough. Set list was probably one of the harder parts because at first we want to fit everything. And we realized we're like, man, that's a lot of songs. We're like, we got to be able to survive the set as well. A bunch of old rockers out there. So we don't, no one needs to have a heart attack on the stage. And it's still probably the longest headlining set we've ever done, even when we were a band. So it's still a monster set. But man, it was tough. I left out stuff that may not be things we have like a video for or like a single, but that I always want to play. So it's a lot of good tunes that hit the cutting room floor, man. It was a bummer.
Yeah, I know the feeling, especially because you have younger fans like ourselves. I mean, I'll just, not to make you feel old, but I was still in high school when the last Shadows Fall album ever came out. So,
yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and Threads of Life was actually my first Shadows Fall album. So you kind of have to like adjust the set list to fit multiple generations.
Well, exactly, man. And then those are some of those later day records. Like that was stuff we were still touring on, and it was a big part of our kind of rotation. So yeah, we cover all the eras. But then it was also when you realize, like, damn, we covered 2 decades of the band. We're like, and it feels like yesterday, so it's still weird that it was 6 years since like the last show. It doesn't feel that long ago. But I've also had 2 kids, since in that time, so life just flew by.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who, became a huge fan of Shadows Fall after discovering you guys, like, I was always able to tell what would be off of One Blood or The Art of Balance or Threads of Life, etc. I've always admired how, like, you've always maintained your sound, but always were able to incorporate new twists into it. And I always think that when I hear an album, especially something as classic as Of One Blood, like, I feel like the context of the album also really develops as the years go by. Like, I still think First Noble Truth is a song. I have not seen Killswitch Engage or All That Remains or Unearthed once without hearing First Noble Truth and like the intermission during like the intermissions. So like, how do you look at sort of like your catalog now as you've grown and developed as an artist and even take a break from the band?
It's funny. It was almost like rediscovering it, getting ready for this show. Cause I was practicing solo at home to like the albums, and I hadn't probably dusted off, Of One Blood where I'm going, in a while. So I guess maybe when the vinyl came out, I probably popped it on to make sure, how it sounded. But, so it was cool to kind of hear those tunes. And also for me, lyrically, being able to tell exactly what I was into or what I've been reading or like, where my thoughts were at during a lot of those songs. So it's funny. You get a very chronological sort of timeline of your personality that you don't realize you had left, because in hindsight, you really, some of those lyrics will jump out where they hit in a different way now than at the time. I was probably just writing and not even noticing how biographical it was, but now I can see it. So it was very cool to see that. And yeah, you hear like, Of One Blood is a very young, raw band that's going for it on every tune, like full on, and like you can hear all the influences really crossing over at that time. But by the time you get to, probably The War Within, you can hear our sound where all those influences have been honed in a way that was like much more our own thing. And I think that just expanded. So it's kind of fun to hear that sonic evolution. And also production-wise, you can hear, just not only improvements because of technology and just budgets and whatnot, but just our different approaches, like how metal production changed through the decades, like you can hear some of that as well, which is cool to kind of follow along. So it was cool. It's also funny to, hear some of those songs after not listening for a while and just being like, all right, man, we were fucking good,
Definitely.
You're like, all right, man, cool. I was a little nervous when I popped these on, I was like, all right, we're pretty good.
Well, when you came into Shadows Fall and for the making of One Blood, were you kind of like looking at Somber Eyes to the Sky, seeing what Phil was doing and being like, okay, this is how I have to sing, this is what the band is about? Or were you bringing a little bit of your own mix into Shadows Fall?
Yeah, I was bringing my own thing right out of the gates, but some of that material had been written to where, I would give it my own twist, but, keeping some of those patterns similar, and they weren't what kind of how I would have probably wrote, just approach-wise. So you had to get used to some of that, where it was like, me, I've learned over the years, I've been cutting syllables for years just so I can fit in more, like breaths and waviness. So some of that stuff was very death metal-y for me coming out of hardcore, where I had to like get used to like these real staccato sort of vocals. And also, Phil's voice, he had a much deeper sort of death metal growl that I couldn't even do if I wanted to, as well as a higher register that was really tough for me note-wise. So I had to kind of find my own little spot in there. I was coming in as definitely a dude in a hardcore band who's like, oh, singing, like, what's key? Like, like, oh, you have to keep it in key? What does that mean? So it was an adjustment, but definitely put my own spin and tried to at least also make those songs from the two recordings sound different enough that it was worth redoing them too. So
yeah.
Luckily we toured a good amount on that material, like, and played a lot of shows. So I was kind of getting, before we recorded, I at least had a way of how I do them and where I take my breath and just, a little more comfort zone.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've always thought that you had a very versatile voice, because after I told you Redemption was my first Shadows Fall song, and the second one was Another Hero Lost, which is a ballad. So, like, I felt like you've always had many different usages of your voice, and having the ability to sing very great cleans and also bring in aggression. Do you almost feel like having different usages of your voice is almost a way of expressing different emotions and expressing maybe even different personalities?
Yeah, definitely. And that's kind of how it happened even naturally, is even from the earliest Overcast stuff, I was always mixing it up because I was like, well, this part just doesn't, it'd be like a more rock riff or like a quieter part. And I'm like, screaming over it just didn't seem right. But also even lyrically, sometimes those points of emphasis lose something if you just brutally scream it through the whole thing too, so you wanted to hit those as hard as you could. So yeah, that was kind of how to get out not only different emotional, but also evoking different emotional responses where you're like, all right, man, this dude's pissed now. Like, you can see the evolution of like how it gets to that. And if it hits right with the music, that's when it makes the most sense to me. So, but also it was a varied influences too. Like the Shadows Fall guys, we listened to just as much, classic rock and early metal as we were to like death metal and more brutal stuff. So to not let those out would seem like a waste, and and just missing something that was a big part of what we were into. So it is funny, in the early days, everyone became used to the screaming, singing stuff in the 2000s and beyond. But in the early days, there was a lot of like, why is this so bipolar singing? Or like, there's also that keep your keep your cleans out of my death metal, kind of vibes too. So we got some backlash, but we're also like, man, and Matt can sing his ass off. So to not use his, giant Pavarotti voice over there, I'm like, that's a sin too. So got to get it in there. And what's funny is he also has the most low, brutal, guttural death metal voice in the band too. So I wasn't going to not use that. So.
Yeah, I feel like you and Burton from Fear Factory were kind of like the two guinea pigs of bringing that melodic singing into the death stuff.
Totally. So, and it's funny how it became such a thing. Everyone was used to kind of hearing that. You were expecting that big, clean chorus to come out, but back in the early days, there just wasn't a whole lot of that. And it's funny to listen to some of the early versions of that type of music coming out, because that was pre-auto tune and pre-studio trickery. So there's some sour notes out there in the early metalcore days.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm guilty of a lot of them myself. I listen back to some early Overcast, is like, ooh, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, I mean, I was going to kind of say this to the end, and if you choose to skip this question, I'll totally understand. But, Shadows Fall coming back, we're all very excited. But some people still want to hear maybe a little Overcast back in the day. Is that ever on?
The doors never close on Overcast. We're all still super good friends. It's usually a matter of logistics where, between, it used to be trying to fit in between me and Mike's touring schedule, but now I'm off the road. So that's not as much of a factor. But now I got to fight against vacation time and work schedules. And the other guy, same thing. So, and then Mike, has to fit it between Kill Switch. And the other thing with a lot of the Overcast stuff is if we can't get time to get that stuff back physically tight and good again, it's tough to do. We don't want to just kind of throw and go with those songs. It's tough. That one, man, those sets, yeah, they're fun for me, but by the end, I'm a puddle. Not only emotionally, but just physically. There's some, when you're 15, 16 and writing lyrics, you're just like a fucking machine gun. There was no need to fit this many words into that short of a riff. And so it's fun to do those tunes, but it's work. So, but yeah, it's never off the table. If it's ever the stars align and we always take the opportunity. We had something amazing hooked up for the year of COVID before that was happening. It was that summer that got canceled and fell through. So we were ready to kind of get back on the horse again for a minute, but it's just so we'll see down the road if it happens again.
Okay.
But I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the right it's usually we hear about bands that are either doing a reunion thing or that that we used to play with back then that's doing an event, and it makes so much sense. We're why would we not do that?
Yeah.
So when those scenarios pop up, we jump at it.
Yeah, because just to have you guys and Unearth on the same bill is already a treat. But I would have loved to make it go more old school. Get Shadows Fall, Overcast, Aftershock, and
we always talked about, we called it the Kissing Cousins show. We're we want to do the Kissing Cousins show where it's Aftershock, Overcast, Shadows Fall, then all the guys, anyone's new band, all that stuff, all have it at once. And but then I was like, yeah, but how are we going to survive that? Physically, I'm I've done one double down, I think it was Downpour set and then an Overcast headliner, and man, and I did a Downpour and a Shadows Fall set, the same thing, and I got through it, but oof.
Yeah.
That's a lot of yelling at people.
Yeah. Well, being such a prolific artist between Shadows Fall, Overcast, Downpour, Death Ray Vision, having so many different projects, is it maybe a different mindset, or are you in a different form of expression, or is there a usual method behind the madness that combines all your projects together?
It's they usually pop up by someone just having sick music that I'm yeah, man, that resonates with me, and I'm into it. And then from there, the music to me is always kind of set the vibe for where the vocals are going to go. So when I got the early Death Ray stuff, me and Mike, they weren't I knew it wasn't going to be Overcast 2.0. It was way more aggressive, early 90s fast hardcore type of vibe. And I was super into it right away. I was yeah, that's perfect. And writing wise, yeah, it's going to have some of my normal kind of sounds. It's just, that's what comes out. But I definitely approached it writing wise way different than Shadows Fall stuff. It was way more immediate. There was a lot less lyrical tricks and poetry type stuff, it was way more straight to the point type of lyrics, because that's what it demanded. And then with Hell Night, when I started jamming with those guys, the guitar sound is so much sounds like a musical shark fight, that I was this is going to be the rawest shit I've ever done, and that stuff just screaming from the fucking your shoes, and that was fun to do something different. And then the downpour stuff was way more melodic and wide open and allowed me to try and probably sing in ways I never really had, bring in some different stuff. So I was, you know, for me, that's what makes those things fun. If it was just like another like kind of shad style thrashy project, it would be cool, but probably wouldn't have been as excited to try that when someone's got something that's kind of different. So, you know, it gets more exciting.
Hmm. As a vocalist, have you always needed to hear the music to come up with lyrics, or does a lyrical idea or a lyrical concept maybe help dictate the direction of the song structure and the sound?
Uh, yeah, it can make me pick lyrics because sometimes I'll have stuff I may have wrote in like stream of conscious free writing style that I'll remember and like kind of earmark, and then something will come along that fits that vibe. But a lot of times, especially with Shadows Fall, I would get a vocal line hooked in my head to a chorus or to a like a single part, and then a lyric would fall into that, and I'd build off of that. But a lot of times, the actual sound of it would be what influenced whatever that first lyric was. If it was like Idle Hands was such a opening brutal thrashy track, and it, you know, had that just straight ahead like steamroller stuff. So like the lyrics have to kind of fit that idea. So it became about like anger management and like, you know, losing control of that stuff. And that just because the music sounded like slowly someone, you know, was heading in that direction where it's like, man, it sounds like a train about to go off the rails, you know? Mm-hmm. So that influenced where those words came from. And so, yeah, I usually, even if I have lyrics that might fit them down the road, I have to hear it before I know where a song's going. Mm-hmm. So I do write solo stuff that like I may be like just messing around on chords and singing along right immediately, and they'll kind of come together. But for the shad stuff, also a lot of times those guys, the way metal's written, a lot of times they have all those ideas figured out in their head, and the time I get a demo, it's pretty dead on where it's going. Where we'll change, you know, some turnarounds and add some, you know, little like, you know, kind of connecting stuff, but they usually have a pretty good idea. So I think that helps. Whereas, you know, if you're doing singer-songwriter stuff, there's a lot more kind of open-endedness when you're writing. These dudes, you know, they're like, these are my riffs. This is how my riffs will stay, you know?
Yeah. Well, when
I work from that skeleton of it, you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, when you joined Shadows Fall, because I know Of One Blood has some somberized material on it, like Two Ashes, for example, and stuff. So, like, do you almost, like, have a different attachment with some of those songs? Because, like, did it almost... not to discredit, because I thought that you brought a whole new lease of life. Like, Two Ashes was, again, I think one of the first real, like, songs that a lot of people gravitated towards in Shadows Fall. Do you almost feel like maybe it was almost kind of like covering it in a way, or a different type of attachment in a way?
I mean, a little bit. Lyrically, I didn't write the lyrics, and some of them were, you know, like that can be tough if you don't have that kind of connection, especially with something so visceral as like metal, you know. But they were, you know, at least they were songs I was already a fan of too, because, you know, Overcast used to play with Shadows Fall, and I was a fan of that first Somber Eyes record. So that was, at least mentally, I already knew all that stuff before I even had a thought about singing it, you know. So at least I was real familiar and into it. So that would have been harder if it would have been like a tune that I'm just like, you know, that would have been tougher. But everything was stuff I was already really into. But really, when you know, that's how I knew to join the band. Is the first thing I got to hear was Serenity, and I was like, oh, this is where you guys all are heading. And I was like, yeah, dude, I could get on that train. I was like, that sounds like fun. And then the next thing I think was Of One Blood or Belial, with one of those two tunes. And I'm like, all right. Yeah, I'm fucking in, man. I was like, you know, let's do this. So it was kind of cool, yeah, to have a handful of songs I was already familiar with as a fan to get to sing and, you know, put my own spin on it. But then also knowing that what was coming around the corner was like a whole nother level of where these dudes' heads were at, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And were your lyrics always open to interpretation as well? Because, like, when I heard Redemption, I thought that was both like an anthem of victory, but also an anthem of despair in a way. I think it was very relatable for positive and negative vibes. And I feel that way about Shadows Fall in general. Like, First Noble Truth, that guitar solo is like the jolliest metal solo, but the vocals are just intense.
It's like happy leprechaun bouncing, you know, like, you know. That's funny, but yeah, no, you know, and that's, I do leave them completely open. Like if someone wants to talk to me about lyrics of what I was thinking, I'm always down to kind of explain certain lines or have fun, you know, about where it came from me. But there is a lot, I always think of myself as like a positive kind of dude. And I always thought my lyrics were positive until you actually start reading them again and listening. And you're like, Oh, well, I do kind of slam the door on some of the positivity by realizing like we should all make the most of it, but we're probably just gonna get hit by an asteroid. And that's the end. You know, like, you know, or like, yeah, you know, never give up, even if the world's never gonna stop throwing shit at you. You know, so there is some of that to it, but the music has a very light and dark element to it as well. I mean, the title "The War Within" was literally about that, fighting those, you know, contrasting ideas in yourself. And also, though, musically, I thought we were like, yeah, man, we're just like, we love the melody, but we also want to like be brutal. And it was, you know, just talking about that kind of like duality, to quote Slipknot, you know, of just that approach, but also where I was mentally. I was like, man, we were having an amazing time in life where like things are going great, but also we're on the road and it's a grind and it's tough. Like, you know, like you just feel beat up, but you wouldn't trade any of it at the same time. So you're just, you know, it's about that like the art of balance was about trying to figure it out. The war within was realizing that you're never going to figure it out, sort of, and you just have to keep walking that tightrope and learning constantly. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Then by the time Threads of Life, I'm like, oh, all the threads are coming undone, you know.
Yeah, and that's why we
we're so fucked.
Well, I was listening to your episode of Doc Coyle's podcast, and you even thought about like doing like the most like Atlantic Records sellout thing, like you'll be able like where like that would have just pissed all your fans off. Was it that on the Threads of Life album?
What's that? Well, yeah, no, like, you know, Threads of Life was our first Atlantic record. We're like, you know, like, you know, there's the you know, not like pressure to do anything that's commercial, but you're like, well, if we're ever gonna write our Black album, like, you know, full, you know, right turn thing, you're like, this is the time. I'm like, that's not what we do, you know. So I was joking about this. I was, you know, listening to Redemption just, you know, while going through old tunes, and I'm like, this was our major label single release, and it literally in the middle has a fucking turnaround time that's all off tempo with just this crunching like crazy guitar with brutal vocals that goes into sweep picking for the solo. And we're like, yeah, here's our radio song. Sorry, you know, like, yeah. It's like there's double bass everywhere. We're like, yeah, that's us thinking. And we probably were like, man, all right, we're writing our radio style stuff, you know.
Yeah, radio.
Listening back, like we obviously didn't know what was happening on the radio.
Yeah, well, for the metalcore bands, like for you guys and All That Remains in Killswitch, like your least heavy song is like Burzum to the radio friendly crowd.
Exactly, that's what I mean. You're listening to stuff that's on there. We're like, you know, Daughtry is on the rock radio. We're like, yeah, I think this is a little different now that I kind of listen to these things, you know, like
yeah.
Like, which we did get some crossover play here and there, but you know, it always gets relegated to that like metal hour, you know, somewhere along the way or whatever, with the occasional dude who's just like, I don't care, I'm playing it, you know, like
yeah.
But you know, you just listen back, we're like, yeah, that was definitely not like us like suddenly dropping like, you know, Enter Sandman on the world, you know, like it was definitely like still Shad, but like what we, you know, us foolishly being like, this is our commercial side, you know.
definitely. Being that, you know, with reuniting, and you know, you've played with a lot of projects, but you know, Matt being an Act of Defiance and Jason playing with Overkill and everybody kind of going off and doing their own thing, did that maybe allow you guys to come back together and have some new tricks and twists and maybe bring new sides to Shadows Fall that we haven't seen until this reunion show?
Without a doubt, and honestly, these guys, especially, you know, John and Jason have been full-on touring full-time with two legendary and super professional bands in Anthrax and Overkill. So, like, those dudes are, like, at the top of their game in every way. I've been playing a bunch of shows, but I haven't, like, done any, like, real touring type of stuff. So I had to, like, make sure physically I was going to be ready. So when I was practicing the set, I literally had headphones on, and I would do cardio in between any of the vocals, to just trying to simulate like the adrenaline and the chaos and that type of thing, and also see if I could make it through a hour and a half, you know, headlining set. So, but man, and Paul hadn't played really with anyone since we stopped. So he really went into the work shed and, you know, was playing a ton again. We got to practice and we're like, man, we sound better than we used to, but also we were notoriously bad about rehearsing. We would like do like one rehearsal before like an 8-week tour, and halfway through it, we're like, we know these songs. I mean, do we really have to play Destroy Our Senses again? We know fucking Destroy Our Senses. And looking back, we're like, man, we should have rehearsed. We're like, we're really good when we rehearse. You know, like all the harmonies are on lock. We're like, man. And this whole week, we've just been like, all right, we sound good. We're like, we're ready. So hopefully, barring technical difficulties or any of the things that normally follow Shadows Fall around, we're definitely ready to come out and crush it. So now, if the gear can keep up with us, we're ready.
Hell yeah. And I kind of wanted to go back to something you said too, because both you and Matt, I think that's a key sound in Shadows Fall as well. The sound of you and Matt kind of combining your vocals together. When it came to like writing the lyrics or like singing together, do both of you kind of need to be in the same headspace in order to kind of make the song sound consistent?
Honestly, he's great because I just throw crazy shit at him and he figures out a way to make it work. I do write all the lyrics that were there. Occasionally, though, he'll have this amazing melody over something he wrote, and he may just have some words to kind of fill it. And there's been a few times where I'm like, those are great, and they've kind of, end up being a part of something. It's like First Noble Truth is a perfect example of that, where that chorus, when he comes in, that was just a melody he had from writing that on an acoustic. And I was like, dude, that's perfect. I was like, I'll just scream around in the background, you sing that part. And the lyrics he had were cool and fit into where I was already taking the song. So, but then with some other stuff, like whether it's Redemption or even parts of like My Demise, I just write what I think is this maniacal high note, like just crazy all over the place stuff I can't do. And I'm just like, that's your job now. So you got to do that. Oh, damn it.
Typical.
While playing this riff that you wrote, never expecting to sing over.
Well, in order for you to have gotten that inspiration to write lyrics or just write the music in general, did like ideas come out of the blue, or did you always have to kind of like be in a certain place or be in a certain element in order to cultivate ideas?
It can really kind of vary, but there were times like in the early days I was probably free writing more and just having a ton of ideas everywhere, even if they were bits and pieces of paper and stuff. These days, honestly, I probably write in chunks because I'll get into, like where I just kind of like focus on stuff and be like, all right, I like gonna take these couple tunes and just go for it. I'm also learning though to be more immediate with stuff. I used to get obsessive about changing little words and being like, I have a syllable count that I just have to hit because that's the only way that's going to make sense, and just drive myself crazy over it until I realize, like, dude, you can tweak the pattern a little. Like, I've gotten way more natural about it and less analytical, but which probably comes from not being as dependent on the music business now. Whereas, by the time 2005 rolls around, it's your full-time job, and it's, you're just signing to majors and you're doing records an hour, expected to sell. You feel like everything's got to be perfect, and you're probably overthinking things because of those outside influences. Where now I'm like, man, like the original inspiration is probably the best, which is hilarious because the song Inspiration on Demand is about that, like just of like trying to force yourself to like write something that's inspired. That I'm like, well, maybe just take that first inspiration and run with it. So it's been a growing process, but I probably used to before have a plethora of material. That's the other thing. Now when I start, I'm like, well, shit, I got to write something because I don't have, there's the well is dry as far as just stuff floating around because I've written, when I start looking back at the amount of records, I'm like, man, that's a lot of songs and a lot of words. You got to make sure I don't repeat myself too.
Yeah. and
that sounds cool. Like, yeah, on the second death ray, you're like, oh, damn it.
Well, you have so much in your catalog that you have to think about too that almost reflect the time period of your life. Like next year, correct me if I'm wrong, but next year is like the 30-year anniversary of Overcast bleed into one, right? Like,
yeah, totally, and it's crazy. That stuff is insane to me to think about because when we started, we were like high school kids. Like Mike was the only one old enough to have a license. I think Jay was actually 8th grade when we started, and it's crazy to think how long ago that was. And crazy to think that those songs still kind of resonate with some people. It's pretty awesome to think about. But then also when you look back at the legacy of like Exodus, who are still touring, and Maiden and stuff, you're like, as soon as we feel like we have this mammoth like history, you're like, yeah, and we're a drop in the bucket compared to like that stuff. And those dudes are also still going out and playing 2-hour headlining shows and killing it. It's like, all right, all right, we got to keep working.
Yeah. Well, no disrespect to a lot of the legacy bands, but as somebody who has seen bands of your style live, numerous times, the intensity that you guys have, because none of us are getting any younger, but like I've seen footage of Shadows Fall and Kill Switch Engage and All That Remains and Unearth, and you guys still have the same stage presence as you do now. Those legacy bands, again, they're killing the material. That's what matters. But they're pretty, like, I could put a cardboard cutout on their position on stage and they could play behind it, and I wouldn't be able to tell watching from the bleachers. You know what I mean? So I like people. So like I don't. If some bands like of your style are being like, man, 30 years of material, we're getting too old. I'm like, well, I wouldn't want to see Dillinger Escape Plan and then, Greg Puciato sitting there like he's Billy Corgan,
Totally. Well, that's the other thing about some of this type of music. It can be a Peter Pan scenario because it keeps you young because it's so physical, that like, and you have to put that intensity. But you're right, as far as when it gets to a point where you can't bring that kind of energy, this music won't translate in a live scenario. Because like that whole just vibe is what, really connects. And same thing with like old hardcore bands. You go and see like, youth of today who are all like probably like 60 or like close to it, and they're fucking going nuts. And you're like, all right, physically they know they can do it. Whereas other bands have literally, who of that style have stopped because they're like, we can't. They're like, yeah, we can't. And as soon as they can't, it's not where, it's like, yeah, that'll just change it.
Yeah.
At least when you're as big as Maiden, you can be like, well, we literally have a blow-up giant eddy and then a sword fight happening here while planes fly overhead. We're like, they can at least get enough Vegas and theatrics going on that they can just kind of stand there and you're like still like blown away.
Yeah.
If we could afford to blow up Dragon, we might like extend our life a little longer, but not in the budget these days.
You're damn right. And like another question I wanted to ask you, and I'm just going to warn you now, probably every interview that you're going to do is probably going to touch upon this issue, or not issue, but like this topic. So, and apologies to all the viewers because you were probably expecting it too, but the metalcore genre that a lot of people credit you for cultivating. I want to hear it from you particularly, because I've had a lot of this discussion to people. What is metalcore? And they would say like, oh, it's music that has singing and screaming in it. I'm like, oh, so does that make Soilwork or Opeth or Fear Factory metalcore? So to you, what makes metalcore metalcore?
It's funny because to me it is 100% based on age groups, because to me personally, when I first used the term metalcore, it was to describe bands like Integrity from Cleveland, even like later day Agnostic Front and Cro-Mags. It was hardcore bands that you knew were hardcore bands just because of, look, approach, stage presence, everything, but who could also just bring these like super crunchy metal riffs. And then the next stage would be like Earth Crisis, BOD, those bands. So that to me will always be metalcore. And it's funny because when Shadows Fall first started, we had been in hardcore bands, quote unquote, before that. So we were immediately called kind of metalcore. But I was listening to it as an outsider, like, this is thrashy melodic death metal to me, Granted, there's a breakdown here and there every now and then. But, it wasn't. But from that era, I do, that's that vibe is, Kill Switch, Us, even a little Hatebreed in there, All That Remains, Unearthed. That's what people, I think, consider metalcore then. But to me, it preceded all that, where you had those like kind of crossover bands, like Integrity and Ringworm and shit like that. That was metalcore, and they didn't really sing. To me, it was just like they're bringing like Slayer riffs, but over like a beatdown drum beat with a front man who's like, a full on like hardcore experience. So, that's the shit that'll be metalcore to me. All Out War, Marauder, Integrity.
Yeah.
So, but I'm also fucking old, so that's that's what it is to me.
Yeah.
But most people, when they heard that term, it was probably when it was more bands like either the later day, like Overcast, Stark Weather stuff, or like Kill Switch, Shadows Fall, that stuff.
Yeah.
But it is funny. You listen back to our early shit, you're like, that's death metal riffs, man. They're death metal riffs.
Yeah. Well, because
maybe they were played by hardcore kids so sloppy. That's the only reason.
Yeah. Well, see, I graduated high school in 2012, so the idea of metalcore for a lot of people was bands, and I'm gonna get, this is the words of other people, not me, for people who are watching, but people were saying Bring Me the Horizon was metalcore, like
totally.
Escape the Fate.
By the end, I think by the end of our like kind of touring time, we were considered more like, all right, they are just a metal band with some hardcore influences, but or we'd get the new wave of American heavy metal, which was always great when you're like a 15-year-old band and you're a new, you feel old. Uh, but then all of a sudden, yeah, metalcore. By the time we were on our way, it was more bands like that you're talking about. The Bring Me the Horizons and those type of bands, where it was kind of heavy verses and breakdowns, but then the huge poppy like melodic chorus. You know, so and that does also kind of make sense. But to me, that's more like mixing the more like rock pop elements with metal, like than it is hardcore.
Yeah.
But that also happened with stuff like emo. To me, emo will always be like bands are on, Discord records like Fugazi and stuff back in the early '90s. But that was not what it became by 2000 hit. It was basically pop punk with other stuff. Was now emo, and I'm like, all right, I just called it emotional hardcore, and it was all these bands that were insanely screamy, but also like you could tell they had feelings.
Yeah. Well, I never
So
understood.
I think genres twist, through the years.
Yeah. Well, I never understood why people like could love hardcore and not like metal and vice versa. Because to me, Slayer or Iron Maiden are just as brutally honest and raw and intense as an Agnostic Front or a Sick of It All. So I've never understood how I never understood I went to my first hardcore show in a metal shirt thinking it wasn't going to be any different than any other show except more sweaty people and more crowd interaction.
Yeah, it's weird because I grew up in a weird time in the Boston scene where there was a lot of bands mixing that stuff up. But like there was still a divide between the shows. It did start to, as the more local it was, the less that stuff mattered when we were kind of coming up, which is why you got bands like us and Converge and Kill Switch doing weird shit because we were listening to everything and it was kind of open-minded within the scene. But the old shows when I was first young, yeah, I mean, there was two crowds rotate in and out for like the thrash show and for the Slapshot show, or whoever was playing on the matinee. It was, but it was funny. All the bands would always talk about how they're like, especially the guitar players are like, well, I mean, I listen to metal because like that's where the riffs are, and like vice versa, And the metal dudes were like, yeah, every now and then I just want to write a stomp riff. So the bands always, I think, were more open to it. So it's funny how that works. But man, Overcast used to get that shit where we'd play with like straight edge bands and you could see like a lot of the like keep your metal out of my hardcore stuff, like back then. So, but we didn't give a shit. And honestly, back then, we were just happy to play anywhere. We would play with death metal bands, hardcore bands, ska bands. We didn't give a shit.
Yeah, the less shits you give, the more shit you get. That's how I've always.
Exactly.
Yep.
There you go. There you go. Words to live by.
Yep. We are here with Brian Fair of Shadows Fall. They are officially back. This is Alex from Heavy New York, and we will see you next time.